They stole my solar panels, forgetting I work for the state's Energy Commission. What happens next will leave you speechless. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that made the neighborhood feel like a quiet retreat. The sun cast its golden glow across neatly trimmed lawns and rows of suburban homes, each one looking like a perfect picture. The scent of freshly mowed grass hung in the air, a familiar reminder of spring's arrival. Everywhere Marcus looked, he saw signs of the neighborhood's peaceful charm. The distant hum of a lawnmower, the chirp of birds in the trees, and the rustle of leaves swaying in the breeze. It was as if the world was going on as usual, calm and serene. But the peacefulness shattered in an instant when Marcus turned his gaze upward. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto the empty roof mounts where his solar panels had once proudly stood. The sight of the barren rooftop felt like a punch to the gut, leaving him momentarily breathless. His fingers clenched into fists by his sides as he stood frozen in his driveway, staring in disbelief at the spot where his panels had been for years, an investment in his home, his future, and the planet. They had been a point of pride, a decision he'd made with intention, something that set his home apart. And now they were gone. Marcus blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the situation, but the reality of it was too much to process in a single moment. How could this have happened? Who would do such a thing? And why? He was about to turn back toward his front door, his mind already racing with questions and growing anger, when he noticed her. Karen. She was sitting in a lawn chair near the sidewalk, an iced coffee in hand, the cold beverage shimmering in the afternoon light. Her posture was relaxed, almost smug, as she sat back in the chair with her legs crossed, taking in the scene before her as if it were just another day. As if she hadn't just ripped away something that had taken Marcus months of careful planning and thousands of dollars to install. As if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Karen caught his eye, her lips curling into a faint, self-satisfied smile. There was an unsettling ease in her demeanor, the kind of relaxed authority that came from knowing she had power over those around her. The faintest flicker of triumph danced in her gaze as she set her coffee cup down on the grass and gave Marcus a single, almost dismissive shrug. "Those panels are illegal," she said, her voice smooth and clipped, as though she were declaring the weather had changed. No explanation. No apology, just an accusation, sharp and final. Her words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, trying to absorb what she had said. His fists tightened as his blood began to boil. Anger surged through him, but he knew better than to lash out immediately. This was a test, one that he wasn't about to fail. He could feel his pulse quickening, the familiar tightness in his chest, but he pushed it down. There was no room for rash decisions here. Karen, oblivious to the storm of emotions that had just been triggered within him, stretched her arms out and reclined further into her chair. She had no idea what she had just done. No idea who she was dealing with. Marcus had lived in this neighborhood for years, known as the reliable, upstanding neighbor. He had volunteered at community events, helped with neighborhood watch programs, and always kept his lawn pristine. He was the kind of man who kept to himself, who had always played by the rules. But Karen didn't know this about him. What she didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just a homeowner. He was someone who worked for the state's Energy Commission, a professional with an in-depth understanding of energy laws. He was an expert on regulations, codes, and the legalities surrounding solar energy. And now, with one simple, arrogant remark, "Karen, I'll be seeing you, Karen," he muttered under his breath, his voice low and steady, though the words carried weight. His eyes narrowed as his mind started to race, already thinking ahead to his next move. He couldn't act impulsively. This needed to be planned, calculated. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. As he turned to walk toward his front door, his mind buzzed with thoughts of everything he had at his disposal. He had been meticulous in keeping records of his solar installation from day one. Every document, every inspection, every conversation with contractors and city officials. His panels were legal. They were up to code. He had checked. But Karen didn't know that. She thought she could just bulldoze through her authority, but she had underestimated him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, his gaze flickering over the text from his colleague at the Energy Commission. The message was brief, but it was enough to make his heart race with excitement. The city's been having issues with certain HOA presidents. Keep your eyes open. Marcus smiled faintly to himself. This was going to be more than just a fight over solar panels. It was going to be a battle to expose the corruption that ran through the HOA system. Karen had just given him the perfect opening, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. As he entered his house, the door shutting softly behind him, Marcus leaned against the frame for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. His mind was already moving, already plotting the steps that would lead to Karen's downfall. He wasn't going to rush this. Patience was key. He would let her dig her own grave, and when the time was right, he would strike. Marcus knew that the neighborhood had no idea what was really going on. They didn't see the behind-the-scenes manipulation, the favoritism, the power games that Karen had been playing. But he would expose it all. The more mistakes she made, the stronger his case would become. And as for those solar panels, they would be the least of Karen's worries. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and research. Marcus spent hours reviewing every piece of evidence he had gathered, making sure everything was in order. His confidence grew with each new discovery. Every email, every document, every conversation was another brick in the wall he was building against Karen. She had no idea what was coming. But as Marcus prepared to take the next steps, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something more to this. Something deeper. As he sifted through the records, a name popped up, a city official who had been involved in approving Karen's actions. A sudden twist, an unexpected link in the chain that could change everything. Marcus paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. This wasn't just about solar panels. This wasn't just about a petty HOA president making trouble. This was bigger. It was about exposing a system of corruption, a system that could only survive if people like Karen remained unchallenged. But Marcus wasn't afraid to challenge her, and he would do whatever it took to bring her reign of terror to an end. And as he sat back in his chair, his mind racing with the possibilities, one thought stood out above the rest. Karen's downfall had just begun. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the trees, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. Birds chirped in the distance, and the scent of freshly mowed lawns lingered in the air. It was the kind of peaceful Saturday that made it hard to believe anything could disrupt the calm. But just behind that serene facade, trouble was brewing. Marcus had seen it coming, but he never imagined it would happen so quickly. Karen, the HOA president, stood at the corner of her driveway, hands on her hips as she watched Marcus from across the street. The woman's eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked over his solar panels, her lips curling into a tight, disapproving frown. To the outside observer, she appeared every bit the concerned neighbor, maintaining order and decorum. But beneath the surface, Marcus knew she was a different kind of person, someone who believed in control, in maintaining power, even at the expense of others. Marcus had always been careful to maintain his home to the highest standards. His solar panels, placed with careful precision on the roof, were his pride and joy. Not only did they represent his commitment to sustainability, but they were also a symbol of progress, a sign that he wasn't just following trends, but helping to make the world a better place. So, when Karen took notice of the panels, he didn't think it was an issue. The HOA had always been focused on maintaining appearances, flowers, fences, lawns, but nothing that should have threatened the spirit of community. At least, that was until Karen decided it was her place to assert dominance over every inch of their lives. The first signs of trouble had been subtle. An unexpected fine here, a surprise complaint there. But soon enough, those small irritants snowballed into something far larger, something far more dangerous. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was wielding them like a weapon, using every minor infraction as an excuse to lord over the neighbors. Marcus had witnessed her bully others for the slightest violations: an overgrown hedge, a mailbox that was too colorful, a tree that had grown too tall, and, as time went on, he began to hear whispers that she was using her position to benefit herself in ways no one dared question. The rumors had been hushed whispers, nothing too solid, until Marcus had seen for himself. It was during one of those impromptu HOA meetings that Karen's power grabbed hold of the room. It had been just a simple conversation about lawn maintenance. Yet somehow, Karen had turned it into a power struggle, making people uncomfortable for the smallest things. One resident, an elderly widow, was threatened with eviction because her garden had distracted from the neighborhood's aesthetic. That was when Marcus realized Karen wasn't simply enforcing rules. She was controlling people's lives. He had thought it wouldn't come for him. After all, he was a respected member of the community. But when his eyes landed on his roof, his heart sank. His solar panels, once gleaming in the sun, had disappeared. Karen, in her need to prove dominance, had ordered them removed. No warning, no consultation, just an arbitrary decision that crushed something he'd worked for. He hadn't even been notified in advance. Nothing at all. Just an empty roof where once there had been progress. As he stood there, still frozen in shock, his eyes met Karen's. She was sitting on her front porch, sipping an iced coffee. A smug expression plastered across her face, as if she were watching a child throw a tantrum. She didn't even flinch when their eyes locked. With a casual wave of her hand, she gestured toward his roof. "Those panels are illegal," she said flatly, not even bothering to explain why. Her tone was cold, final, as though making a simple statement about the weather. It was as though she knew that, as the HOA president, she had the final say in everything. No argument, no back and forth, just her rules, her way. Marcus stood there for a moment, the words hanging in the air. He could feel his blood begin to boil, his hands clenching at his sides. He wanted to shout, wanted to demand an explanation, but he knew it wasn't worth it. Arguing with Karen in that moment would only give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. No, he would handle this on his terms, in a way she would never expect. He gave her a tight smile and nodded, as though he had just been informed of a minor inconvenience. "I'll be seeing you, Karen," he said under his breath, but just loud enough for her to hear. Her smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered, not realizing the weight of the words he had just spoken. Marcus turned on his heel and walked back to his house, each step heavy with the resolve he was now carrying. That evening, as Marcus sat at his desk, the weight of the day's events settled into him. He had to do something. Karen wasn't just another homeowner. She was an insidious force that had taken control of the entire neighborhood. She had weaponized her position, made herself untouchable in the eyes of the residents. The situation had escalated far beyond petty lawn violations. She had begun to take everything personal. His panels weren't just another infraction to her. They were a symbol of progress that she couldn't control, and that had set her off. Marcus' mind was racing now. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about a few solar panels. This was about power. And Karen, like so many before her, had forgotten the one thing that all those in power seem to forget. Power can be undone. He spent the next few hours digging through the HOA rules, scanning over energy laws, and reviewing city ordinances about green energy. He needed to know exactly where Karen had overstepped. It wasn't just her theft of his panels that concerned him. It was the complete disregard for regulations that she had shown. She wasn't just a petty dictator. She was a corrupt one. And it was about time someone held her accountable. The more Marcus dug, the more he discovered. It wasn't just the panels she had targeted. She had begun to play fast and loose with the HOA's funds, pocketing money meant for maintenance and infrastructure. She had a history of manipulating the HOA's finances, using fines to line her own pockets. It was all there, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and quiet intimidation. Karen had built her empire of control by crushing everyone around her, all while lining her own pockets. Marcus smiled grimly as he closed his laptop. He had everything he needed. All it took was patience, and the ability to stay calm while the storm raged around him. Karen had made a massive mistake. She had underestimated him. The next week, Marcus attended another HOA meeting. This time he was ready. As the meeting droned on, filled with mundane complaints about lawn colors and mailbox sizes, Marcus kept his focus on the goal. He wasn't here to argue over trivial matters. He was here to expose the truth. As the meeting reached its peak, He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, drawing everyone's attention. "I have something that will change everything," Marcus said, his voice steady, but with a hint of resolve that caught everyone off guard. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him, including Karen's, who was sitting at the front, her usual air of superiority faltering for just a second. With a calm and deliberate motion, Marcus pulled out a folder of evidence, a mix of financial records, recordings, and official documents. He played the first piece of evidence, a video of Karen herself, giving orders to remove his solar panels. It was damning, and as it played, Marcus could see the color drain from her face. Karen opened her mouth to protest, to deny it, but the weight of the truth was too heavy. This was just the beginning. The air in the neighborhood felt unusually still, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Marcus stood at the edge of his driveway, staring at the barren roof where his solar panels had once stood. The sense of disbelief he'd first felt when he noticed the removal had begun to shift into something much darker, a quiet, simmering rage. The panels had been more than just a practical addition to his home. They were a statement, a symbol of his commitment to a cleaner, more sustainable future. And now they were gone, stolen. He clenched his fists, the muscles in his arms tensing under the pressure. His mind raced with possibilities, ways he could confront Karen directly, expose her arrogance, but none of those thoughts felt like the right approach. Not yet. He wasn't going to play her game. No, this needed to be different. This needed to be his victory, not just a moment of revenge. Karen had made a mistake, one that would cost her more than she could ever anticipate. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, Marcus turned his attention back to the small group of neighbors who were still outside, going about their business. They waved to him, some with the familiar friendly gestures of those who had shared many neighborhood barbecues, casual chats in the yard, and the occasional friendly nod in passing. He knew them and they knew him. They respected him, his work, his contributions to the community. But none of them truly understood the extent of the fight he was about to enter. They had no idea just how far Karen had gone. It wasn't just about the panels anymore. It wasn't even about the violation of HOA rules that supported green energy. It was about something much more sinister. Karen had crossed a line, and Marcus knew that once that line had been crossed, there was no going back. This wasn't just a matter of correcting a wrong. It was about exposing the unchecked power that people like Karen wielded in their small corner of the world. It was about putting an end to her tyranny, not just for him, but for everyone in the neighborhood. Karen thought she had the upper hand, but she was about to learn that Marcus was no ordinary homeowner. He knew that Karen had acted recklessly. She had never imagined that her small-town games, her petty abuse of power, could backfire so spectacularly. As Marcus walked toward his front door, he cast one final glance toward Karen, who was sitting on her porch with her usual air of self-satisfaction. She had no idea that every moment she spent thinking she was in control was one step closer to her downfall. Marcus had been watching her, documenting everything for months. Every word she had spoken, every decision she had made, every rule she had bent or broken, he had it all recorded. Emails, notes, receipts, witness statements. He had built a quiet, impenetrable fortress of evidence, piece by piece. He had been patient, biding his time, knowing that the moment would come when Karen would slip up. And slip up she had. Karen's arrogance was her greatest asset and her greatest weakness. As he sat at his desk later that evening, surrounded by the quiet hum of his home, Marcus began to go over his notes again. His fingers danced over the keyboard as he sifted through emails, legal documents, and the carefully curated evidence he had collected over the past few months. Each document, each email, each phone record was a piece of the puzzle. A puzzle that, once completed, would reveal Karen's true nature and expose her to the world. The more he examined the details, the more he realized that Karen's reckless actions had done more than just violate his property rights. She had violated a system that had been put in place to protect the integrity of the community. She had overstepped in ways that no one had anticipated, and now Marcus had the ammunition to bring her down. What Karen didn't realize, however, was that her mistake wasn't just the removal of the solar panels. No, it was what she did next. Desperate to cover her tracks, she had called in a favor from a city official, someone who could make this whole thing disappear. A simple phone call, a whispered word, a promise to sweep everything under the rug. When Karen had reached out to the city official, asking for a favor, she had unwittingly opened the door to something far more dangerous than she realized. The official had promised to bury the complaint, to make it disappear as if it never happened. But in doing so, he had left behind a trail of evidence, proof that bribery had been involved, proof that corruption was at play. Marcus had what he needed now, not just the legal grounds to take Karen down, but the moral high ground as well. The city official's promise, the bribe, the corruption, it was all documented. All of it was traceable, and Marcus had everything he needed to expose it. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle fit together. The theft of his solar panels was just the beginning. It was a small act, one that might have seemed insignificant to Karen, but in the grand scheme of things, it was the spark that had set everything into motion. And Marcus was ready. As the days passed, he quietly continued to gather more. He knew that the stakes were high now, and that Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. But even in the face of this new threat, Marcus wasn't intimidated. He wasn't going to stop. He had come too far to back down now. The final piece of the puzzle was almost in place. Soon, Karen would be exposed for what she truly was, a fraud, a criminal, a tyrant. And when that moment came, there would be no turning back. Marcus took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. The battle wasn't over yet, but he was ready for whatever came next. He had the law on his side, the evidence to prove it, and the patience to see it through. Karen had made a big mistake, and it was time for her to face the consequences. Marcus knew that this battle wasn't going to be won with haste. His calm demeanor disguised a simmering intensity, a focused determination that had been building for weeks. He wasn't the type to lash out in anger, especially not against someone like Karen. The HOA president had been a constant thorn in his side, someone who thought she could control everyone in the neighborhood with her petty rules and self-imposed authority. But Marcus had learned that the best way to fight back wasn't with force. It was with strategy. As the days dragged on, Marcus methodically built his case. Every interaction he had with the neighbors, every conversation about the solar panels, every mention of Karen's increasingly tyrannical behavior, he had gathered it all. He spent hours going through his files, reviewing the legal documents he had collected over the years, and speaking to workers who had been involved in the removal of the solar panels. Each piece of evidence brought him closer to the moment when he would finally reveal Karen for who she truly was. It wasn't just about the panels anymore. No, it had become so much more than that. Karen's actions had gone far beyond simply removing a few solar panels. She had been systematically abusing her power for years. The residents of the neighborhood had lived in fear, afraid to speak out, afraid of the fines, the threats, and the constant scrutiny under which they lived. Karen had made them feel powerless. She had made Marcus feel powerless. But now he had control. Now it was his turn to strike. He knew exactly what he was doing, every step of the way. He'd been preparing for this moment for a long time, long before the panels had been torn from his roof. He was playing the long game, and he was patient. Marcus understood the stakes. This wasn't just about winning a personal battle, it was about exposing the truth. Karen's reign of manipulation and corruption had to come to an end, and Marcus would be the one to make sure it did. As he worked, the weight of the situation didn't faze him. He remained calm, outwardly unruffled by the storm brewing beneath the surface. But his mind raced with every new discovery. He had videos, financial records, witness statements, all the pieces he needed to destroy Karen's carefully crafted world. One by one, he'd gather the evidence, build his case, and when the time came, he would bring it all crashing down. Finally, the day arrived. The HOA meeting, the one that Marcus had been anticipating for so long, was just hours away. The room would be packed with people, all of them curious, all of them waiting to see what Marcus would do. He had already quietly informed the press, making sure that every piece of evidence he had gathered would be seen by the public. Karen wouldn't be able to hide. She wouldn't be able to lie her way out of this one. When Marcus entered the HOA meeting, his nerves were steady, his face calm. He stood at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd, watching as Karen sat in her usual spot, arms crossed, a smug expression on her face. She hadn't a clue what was about to happen. She hadn't yet realized that her empire of control was about to crumble. Marcus took a deep breath. His heart raced, but his expression never faltered. He was ready. He was more than ready. "I have something that will change everything," he announced, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife. The room fell silent, every eye turning toward him. He could feel Karen's eyes on him, watching with that same arrogant look. But the moment she saw the first piece of evidence, the moment she saw the video of her ordering the removal of his solar panels, that confidence began to waver. Her eyes widened as she recognized the footage. She knew what it meant. She could see her own actions on display, and there was no denying it. The video played, showing Karen standing on his roof, barking orders to the workers who had removed the panels. The footage was crystal clear. Marcus watched as Karen's face drained of color. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to act as if nothing was wrong, but the facade was already cracking. Her voice wavered as she tried to speak, but her usual dominance had disappeared. No, that's not," she began, but Marcus was already moving forward, his calm voice interrupting her. "Let me continue," he said, presenting the next piece of evidence. A series of financial records that traced the bribe Karen had paid to the city official in an attempt to cover up her theft. The records were damning, the evidence irrefutable. Karen's face twisted with fear, and for the first time, Marcus saw her squirm. The tension in the room was palpable. The board members, once her allies, now exchanged uncomfortable glances. The residents of the neighborhood, who had once feared her, watched in stunned silence as the truth began to unfold. But Marcus didn't stop there. With every piece of evidence he presented, Karen's carefully constructed world crumbled a little more. There were records of her fraudulent claims, illegal fines, and manipulation of the HOA system to line her own pockets. Each revelation stung, and the room was filled with gasps of disbelief. By the time Marcus reached the final piece of evidence, the document proving that Karen had been pocketing HOA funds, Karen's confidence had completely shattered. She was no longer the arrogant, untouchable figure that everyone had once feared. She was a criminal caught red-handed, and there was no escape. The room fell into complete silence as Marcus placed the document on the table. The sound of it hitting the surface was like a death knell. Karen's composure disintegrated. Her eyes filled with panic as she tried to explain, but her words were incoherent, her voice shaking. The lies she had told so many times before no longer held any weight. The community, who had once lived in fear of her, now saw her for what she truly was, a fraud, a thief, a criminal. And Marcus? He was the one who had exposed it all. With the final blow dealt, Marcus stood tall, watching as Karen's world fell apart. Her face, once proud and defiant, was now a mask of humiliation. She broke down in front of everyone, her tears falling freely as she realized that there was no way out. The power she had once held was gone. The reign of terror she had inflicted on the neighborhood was over. As the meeting drew to a close, the authorities were called in. Karen was arrested, her hands cuffed behind her back as she was escorted out of the building. The charges came quickly: bribery, theft, financial fraud. The community watched in silence, some with expressions of disbelief, others with quiet satisfaction. Marcus could feel a wave of satisfaction wash over him. The long months of preparation had paid off. Karen's greed, her arrogance, and her manipulation had caught up with her. She had thought she could control him. She had thought she could control everyone. But in the end, Marcus had proven her wrong. As Karen was led away, Marcus felt a sense of justice settle over him. The community, once fractured by fear and control, could finally breathe again. The HOA was dissolved, and with it the reign of Karen's oppression. The neighborhood was free to rebuild, free to live without fear of arbitrary fines or petty rules. Marcus didn't just get his solar panels back. He reclaimed something much more important. He reclaimed his peace of mind. And the community, they had learned a valuable lesson. Standing up for what was right had torn down the walls of fear and control that had held them captive for so long. The neighborhood was stronger than ever. And Marcus? He was proud to have been the one to lead them to freedom. As the dust settled and the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus stood on his porch, looking out over the neighborhood. His victory wasn't just about the panels. It was about showing that, no matter how powerful someone was, they couldn't get away with corruption forever. Integrity, patience, and perseverance had won the day, and Marcus knew, deep in his heart, that he had done what was right. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, but it highlights the real issues of power abuse and the importance of protecting individual rights against overreaching authority. It serves as a reminder that sometimes those who try to control others may not realize the strength of the individuals they're messing with. Our goal is to raise awareness, provoke thought, and encourage fair treatment for everyone.